intelligence maxing day 65. So I'm currently in one of the buses.
平水不是你那吧？你那里头有2个是吧？不是地下店。
好像不是。Yeah, so good morning everyone. Welcome to intelligence maxing day 65. It's currently about 6 o'clock. I'm on one of the buses right now to go to Baltimore. I'm gonna check out my work route for my internship over the summer. So just wanted to test it out before work actually starts next week. But I'm gonna be doing this pretty often, so I thought I might be able to stream on the way there, on the way back. And today, just want to go over some flashcards and some stuff that I learned about in class. Maybe review some of that. Also, some life cards. So yeah, let's just get right into it. So I think this is Novo Nordisk. Hans Christian Hagedorn was a researcher that ended up founding the Nordisk Foundation. I think he was one of the main pioneers of the insulin market. Okay, so that was pretty quick. Let's go back to books. So what are the 3 categories of expenses in earnings report cover, and then also kind of the key accounts that maybe influence to earnings before interest and taxes. Usually that's an indicator of operating expenses and net income. This also includes maybe capital and financing expenses as well. So there's a few things to consider here. I feel like those are the two things I would probably say off the top. Let's see. Correct earnings for accounting misclassifications. Okay. Reporting earnings may bear a little resemblance to earnings because of limitations. Yeah, I'd say it's pretty hard. What's the correct measurement of operating income for a firm? Clear discussion on capital and financial expenses. So I think operating income, Commodore really thinks it should just include capital expenses and then also operating expenses. Okay, so this is where he talks about capitalizing something. So it should be depreciated / amortized over the periods. Depreciated / amortized over the periods that the benefits incurred. Okay, that's it. It's hard. What is a beautiful deleveraging? same period. Let's see. So you also have, I think, capital expenses. These are usually longer term expenses. Think property or plants or equipment. And maybe you're a semiconductor manufacturer, you're building out an entire factory for a new fabrication plant in Arizona. I think that's what TSMC is doing. So that's probably going to be considered a capital expense. And Damodaran, he really suggests that you capitalize it, so put that on your balance sheet, treat it as an asset, and then depreciate it over time. And then you also have things like financing expenses. So these are interest payments, foreign currency translation expenses, even possibly fees paid to investment banks for their financing advisorship. Basically, that fundamental analysis, technical analysis are both hot water. And I think even insider information doesn't really do anything. Yeah. In theory, measuring risk-free rates should vary from year to year due to changes in the term structure. So this is the yield curve. What does Damodaran suggest in practice? Usually it's hard to predict what the term structure is going to look like in the future. So I think Damodaran suggests that all you really need to do is pick today's risk-free rate, maybe the 10-year treasury yield, and just use that as your discount rate, or risk-free rate. So what are two common aspects of valuations where investors usually disagree on? So it's the value of the asset and the time it takes to achieve that value. Value in the error, and time takes for the market price to reflect the real value of the asset. Yeah, okay, that's it, it's fair. What is return on equity? So return on equity is just a metric used to determine the amount of money that you made relative to the equity or the cash you've put into the business. Equity. Okay, so we say, right? We had Ian Goodfellow, Aaron Corbell, Yoshio Bengio. Seems like Ian Goodfellow, he was a researcher at DeepMind, or maybe still is, I'm not entirely sure. Him and all the other authors ended up doing some really good research on generative adversarial networks. So this is really I think this was kind of the state-of-the-art neural network model with a discriminator and a generator, and you do this adversarial training where you're trying to optimize this objective function, but the objective function is minimized by the discriminator and maximized by the generator. Usually it's an objective function that tries to capture the error rate of the discriminator, which tells whether or not an image generated by the generator is real or fake, after you input a vector of some random noise.